Okay, so Unity's opened up now, and you'll see this is what the default interface is. See the Unity is split up into different what they call views. Over here we've got the hierarchy view. The hierarchy view shows all the items in the current scene. A scene is what Unity calls what we would normally refer to as a level. So anything you think of as a level in a game is what would be referred to as a scene in Unity. Underneath the hierarchy, we've got the project view. Everything that you add to your game is shown in the project view. So any assets, whether those are art assets, audio assets, and also scripts and anything like that is shown here. Over here, we got the inspector. The inspector shows properties for any object that you select inside your scene. Right now in our scene, we've got a camera. So when I click on this, you'll see it populates the inspector with a bunch of information about our camera. This here is the scene view. The scene view allows you to see your game visually as it's being built. And if you want to see what your game looks like when it's going to be played, you can switch over to the game view here, or you can press this play button, which allows you to play your game in real time. So those are the different views. So to get started, I'm going to save the scene that we're currently in. So File, Save Scene. And since we haven't saved the scene before, it's going to have us name it. So I'll just call it Game, since this scene will house our game. And click Save. So you'll see now this name over here changed to our game scene. If it didn't, make sure you double click this so that you're in the right scene. Now we're going to create sprites. There's two ways to do this. We can right click here, go to create, and then go down to sprites, and we're going to create square sprites. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it would be to come over here straight up to assets, create sprites square. So I'm going to delete one of these because I don't need it. So we only need this one asset because all of the sprites in our game are going to be the same. Sprites are what we call 2D art assets. So in a 2D game, the art assets are referred to as sprites. So all of our sprites are going to be based on this square. And the way we put this in our game is just click and drag into the scene. Once it's in here, we can manipulate it. So we can grab any of these blue dots on the corners to stretch our square sprite to make it the shape that we want it. So let's start off by making our paddles. So another way to change this is to use the values in the inspector view, which is what I'm going to do to get a more precise look for our sprites. So I'm going to set it to -8 on the x-axis for position and set it to 0 so it's in the middle of the screen on that side. For the scale, I'm going to go to 0.5 and 2.5. We don't need to make any changes to any of our z values because the z value is the 3-dimensional plane, and since this is a 2D game, we won't be using it. Now I'm going to make another one of these. I'm just going to right click it here inside the hierarchy and duplicate. And I'm going to set it, instead of a position of -8, position of +8. Now you see it over there. There's another sprite that we'll need, which is the ball. So I'm going to drag this into the scene. I'm going to set it to the exact center, which is going to be 0, 0. You'll notice it's kind of big. Let's take a look at what that looks like in the game. Yep, it's really big. So I'm just going to change the scale to 0.5 by 0.5, so it's half of its current size. And you'll see that looks a lot better. All right, so now we're going to start working on our paddles. We're going to get those to work the way they're supposed to. Because right now when we run our game, nothing happens. If you press any of the keys, nothing happens because we haven't set anything up to work the way it's supposed to. So let's get started. I'm going to change the names of these so that right now they're both called square. One of them's square parentheses 1. But I want to give them names so I know exactly which one is which. So I'm going to select one. I've selected the left paddle. I'm going to come over here in the inspector, change this square to left paddle, and then hit enter. If you don't hit enter, Unity won't save the changes. So I just added an S here. I'm going to click away, and you'll see it's still called left paddle. So make sure you hit enter. Then I'm going to go to the right paddle and change its name to right paddle. Hit enter. All right, now we know which paddle is which. And these paddles are gonna act similarly. So for the next part, I'm gonna make changes to both of them at the same time. The way I'm gonna do that is select one and then shift, click the other. So now I've got both of them selected. And we're gonna add some components to it. So the first one we're gonna add is a script, and I'm going to create a new script. We can do this multiple ways. We can come here, go to add component, new script, and you can give your script a name there and create a script that way. Or you can come to the project view. Remember I said projects house everything that's going to be in our game? Well, scripts are a part of that. So you go to right click here, create C# script. C# is the programming language that Unity uses. So I'm gonna do that. Now I've got a new script here, and you see the name is highlighted, so I can start typing to change the name. I'm just gonna call it paddle. So I got a new script in there. And I'm gonna go back to selecting both of my paddles. I'm gonna click this, drag it into here. When you see that blue line show up, you drop it. So now that script is on both of them. Some other components that we need is a rigid body. So inside the add component, I'm going to search for rigid body. Rigid bodies are what allow sprites or objects in our game to use Unity's physics engine. So we're going to be using that physics engine to make our paddles move, so we need a rigid body. And since this is a 2D game, we're going to use a rigid body 2D. So I'm going to select that. Now that we've got this, I'm going to make some changes to it. The first thing I'm going to do is change the gravity scale from 1 to 0, because we don't need gravity in our game. We're not going to use gravity. Next, I'm going to change collision detection from discrete to continuous, and set interpolate from none to interpolate. These settings are just going to ensure that the physics are as exact as possible. And there's one more component I'm going to add, which is a box collider. So let's search for box collider. So, and since this is a 2D game, again, we're going to be using a box collider 2D. So just click that, and we should be good. All right. So Unity comes with a lot of different things to make it easier for us to develop our games. One of those is rigid bodies, as I said, which allow objects to use Unity's physics engine. Another one is what's called axes, which are just controls, which we're going to take a look at right now. Let's go to Edit, Project Settings, and then Input. And then you'll see axes, and you'll see this little arrow. Click it to show all the different axes. And let's drop down one of these. Let's look at vertical. So vertical, this right here, look at these different buttons. Aren't these the buttons that you would expect automatically to control vertical movement? Up and down, S and W. Let's take a look at horizontal also. Left and right, A and D. So Unity comes with these axes for controls that are already attached to different buttons that we can use for our game. So we're going to make use of these, but we're going to do something a little bit different because we're going to use up and down arrows to control the right paddle and S and W to control the left paddle. And we can't do that if both of them are set for vertical. We have to have two different axes to control two different objects in our game. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to duplicate this axis. So right click vertical, click duplicate array element, and let's duplicate it twice. So now we've got three different verticals. I'm going to click the first one, change it to left. Or change the left paddle so we don't get confused later on. And then, so our left paddle I mentioned is going to use the S and the W keys to move up and down. So change this down to S and change this up to W, and these we can delete. So we've created a new axis of control for our left paddle to use the W and the S key to move vertically. And now for our right paddle, click the third vertical that we created, change its name to right paddle. And this one, we're gonna leave the up and down the way they are and change the S and W, just delete them. And oops, and then we should be good here. All right, so now we're gonna go back to our paddles and we're gonna change this script component to tell it that we want each of these paddles to use the axes of controls that we just created. So the way we're gonna do that, the way we're gonna open up our C# script is just double click it inside the project view. So double click it, and that'll open up either MonoDevelop or Microsoft Visual Studio, depending on what computer you're using and what you have installed on it and what your settings are for Unity. So for me, I've got MonoDevelop. So this is what MonoDevelop looks like. Microsoft Visual Studio will look the same. There's really no difference. They both compile code the same way and they both work just the same. So let's get started here. So the first thing I'm gonna want is a variable for speed. And we're gonna set this up over here. We're gonna call public float speed. And to start off, I'm gonna set it at 5. So this public in the beginning here, so if you hover over a word, I'm not sure if it does this in Visual Studio, but in MonoDevelop, it'll tell you what those keywords mean. So public, it allows you to change variables inside the editor. So we'll be able to change this value inside Unity without having to open up MonoDevelop or Visual Studio. That's what public's for, because we might decide to mess around with how fast our paddles go later. Float variables are used for numbers with decimals. So 5.5, 1.2, stuff like that. So we might decide later that instead of this being 5, we want it to be 5.5 or something. So that's why we're using the float. And speed is just the name of our variable. Something else about float variables, in Unity, every time you use a float variable, you need this F after the number. Okay. The next variable we're gonna need up here is a string variable for our input. So string variables hold words, and we're gonna call it input because what this variable is gonna do is it's just gonna grab our input axis. All right. So our input axes, you remember you might have noticed, we named exactly the same as our objects. So we've got left paddle and right paddle, and our axes, which are over here, our input axes, share those names. So the way we're gonna set our paddles, since they're both using the same script, the way we're gonna let each paddle know which one to use is just by telling it the name of that script. And the way we're gonna do that is by getting the name of the object itself. And the way we do that is, let's type input equals game object dot name. So this game object that dot name is a variable that holds the name of our game object. So it's going to set our input equal to whatever the name of our game object is. And then over here in update, we're gonna, one thing we're gonna do is we're gonna change this from update to fixed update. Fixed update, so update normal, so this is gonna run every frame of the game. Everything inside this code is going to get called once per frame. So it could vary. It could go up to 60 frames. Your computer could run the game at 60 frames per second, or it can drop down to maybe like 30 frames per second or lower, depending on how good your computer is. So that could vary. And then but we're gonna change it to fixed update, because when we use fixed update, it's always gonna get called at the same rate. And it's better that way for using the physics engine. Void start up here. This only runs, the code in here only runs at the start of the game. So we only need to set our input value at the very beginning of the game, which is why we put that in here. And variables we set up over here so that we can use them in either of these functions. But inside our fixed update now, we're gonna create another variable. We're gonna call it float move, and we're gonna set it to input dot get axis raw. And then parentheses, because this is a function, input. I spelled that wrong, input. So what this variable does is it's gonna grab our axes. And the way it knows which axes to grab is it's gonna look for the one with the name that matches the value stored in input, which is equal to our game object.name. And then now we're gonna use our rigid body to make our panels move. And the way we're gonna do this is get component, and then less than and greater than signs. Inside them, type rigid body 2D. And then parentheses after that, dot velocity equals new vector 2 parentheses 0 move close parentheses times speed. So this is going to give our paddles a velocity of, they're going to move inside the vertical direction using our axes of control at the speed that we set over here. So let's save this. Command S or Control S, and then let's switch back to Unity. Let's play our game, and now we should see something happen. When you press the up arrow, you can move the right paddle up and down. When you press the W and the S key, you can move the left paddle. But something you'll notice is that they can go out of bounds. So we're going to fix this right now. It's going to be really easy. There's no code involved. So let's go back to Unity. I'm going to zoom out a little bit here so we can take a look at what's going on here. So our paddles are going, this border that you see here is the bounds of the viewport in the game when you play it. And our paddles are allowed to go past that line because we have nothing blocking them. So we're going to set up some more sprites. These are just going to be walls. We're going to use these to stop our paddles from going beyond that line there. And also we're going to use it later for making our ball sprite bounce off the top and bottom edges. So I'm trying to set it right now so that it's just outside the viewport. That looks good. I'm gonna rename this to top edge. I'm gonna duplicate it, change its name to bottom edge, and then just change its X position to, or not its X position, its Y position to negative. And that should be good. So if you click your camera preview, or switch over to the game view, you'll see that they're just outside, so you can't see them, but they are there. All right. If you run your game now, though, you'll see that nothing's really changed. You can still go outside, and that's because we haven't added a box collider to our edges, so that our paddles have nothing to collide with, so they don't know that they're supposed to stop there. So let's edit both of these at the same time. Just select both of them, just click, add component, box collider 2D. And then now this should work. Let's see, yep. So on the right side, top and bottom edges work. Left side, top and bottom edges work. Cool. So we're almost done. Let's say we're more than halfway there. So the last thing we need to work on is our ball. So let's select that. It's the only sprite in our game that hasn't been changed from the default square name that it's been given. So let's go ahead and let's start off. Let's change it to ball. And then let's give it a rigid body. We're going to do basically the same thing we did with the paddles. So we're going to need a rigid body 2D. Let's set this to continuous and interpolate and set gravity to 0. It's very important. And then let's get a box collider on it. This box collider, though, it's going to be different than the box colliders we worked with before, because this time we're going to change one of the settings here, which is trigger. We're going to click it, which basically sets that to true. So this is going to be a trigger, and we need it to be a trigger because we're going to add some code to it. So let's create a new C# script. I'm going to call this ball, and then let's go back to our ball. When I changed the name, I forgot to hit enter, so we have to rename it again. Let's drag this. Oops, I selected the paddle script instead of the ball script. So let's add the ball script. I'm going to add it the second way, which is just look for it in here, so I don't click on something accidentally like I did before. So now the ball script's attached to it. Let's double click the ball script to open it. All right, so here's our empty ball script. And we're gonna start off with some variables up here at the top. We're gonna have float speed variable. Let's set this to 5. We might change this later. I'll set it public again. And then our next variable is going to be a vector 2, and we'll call it direction. So I hit enter and something happened. Oh, what happened there? Okay, vector 2 direction. There we go. And then in start, we'll set our direction. Did I spell that right? equal to new vector 2, 1, 1. All right. And then so in our update function, now that we've got our variable set, we're going to make our ball move. So it's not going to move the same way that we moved our paddles, because remember our paddles used axes because we were using input. We're using controls to make them move. But we're not going to make our paddle move with controls. It's going to move by itself. So the way we do that is we're going to go transform dot translate and then type in our values of direction times speed times time with a capital T dot delta time and colon at the end, semicolon. So this is going to do is it's going to change the transform position of our ball so it travels on the vector that we set over here at the speed that we specify here, and this time dot delta time here, it's a way to make our it's another way to make our ball move independent of the game's frame rate without using a fixed update. And then so that looks good there. I am going to set some bounds here. So when our ball goes outside of the viewport, it teleports back to the center. And so the way I'm going to do that is we're going to check to see if the position, the transform, the x position, transform dot position dot x is greater than 10, or if transform dot position dot x is less than negative 10. Hold on, something weird is happening here. These compilers have autocomplete sometimes that can mess up with your code. So there, it looks like it might be fixed now. Hold on. There we go. I think I had a comma there instead of a period. So once this happens, if it goes out of the bounds, we're going to set its position. So transform dot position dot or transform dot position, because we're going to change both its x value and its y value to new vector 2 0 0 0 comma 0. All right, so now if we run our game, we're going to save this. You'll notice that our ball is going to start moving, and when it moves out of bounds, so right now we need to set our ball to collide with the edges of the top and the bottom edge. So the way we do this is, let's go, remember earlier we set our edges to be triggers, or we set our ball to be a trigger. Our ball's box collider to be a trigger. So we're going to use a new function, void on trigger enter 2D collider 2D other. So we just created a new function here. It's called void on trigger enter 2D, and it has two parameters, collider 2D and one called other. So this function is going to get called anytime that our box collider collides with another box collider. So this is what makes This is what makes our collider a trigger, is that we can use this function because it's now a trigger. So we need to check to make sure if it's collided with either an edge or a paddle. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go back to Unity, go to our paddles. Up here by the name of our objects, there's this field called tag. Right now they're both untagged. Let's edit them at the same time. Click this, drop down, go down to add tag. Inside our list of tags, which is currently empty, click the plus sign and give a new tag called paddle. So now we got a tag called paddle. Let's go back to these two paddles and give them the paddle tag. So now they're both marked with a paddle tag. We're going to use this tag to tell what object we've collided with, a paddle or a wall from our top or bottom edge. Let's create an if statement here. So this other here refers to the other object in the collision. So we know that our ball has collided with something, but what's the other thing that it's colliding with is what we're trying to find out. So we're going to look for the tag of that other object by typing other.tag. And if this equals paddle, so that paddle there's a string, so those tags are each strings. We're going to check if it matches the string paddle. If it does, we're going to change its direction in the X position so that it starts moving instead of from right or from left to right to left. So direction dot X, pretty simple way to do that. It's just direction dot X times equals -1. So this just multiplies our current value of X by -1, which is just going to flip it to move the opposite direction. And then if it's not colliding with a paddle, there's only one other thing it can collide with. So we're going to use this else statement here. And when it collides with our walls, we want to change the Y value for the Y direction to negative of what it currently is. So same exact thing as before, just type Y after this direction instead of .x. So when we do that, run our game, and you'll see it'll work the way we expect it to. There you go. You got your ball starting and it bounces off those edges that we can't see because they're out of view. Bounces off our paddles. When it goes out of bounds, it's going to restart in the center. And that's for both the right and the left side. So there you have it. That's very simple Pong.